The rain hadn't stopped in 2 days. Wind howled like it had a soul of its own, tearing through Tacloban's narrow alleys and sending shards of roofing across the flooded streets. I was moving between rescue posts when I saw him, Sirocco. At first he looked like debris, soaked, bleeding, unmoving. But when I knelt beside him, he blinked. Not just a reflex, a choice. His body was torn, one ear gashed, his paw twisted awkwardly. But those eyes stared back at me with something close to defiance. I'd seen hopeless animals before. He wasn't one of them. He wanted to live. I radioed in our position and called for backup, but it was just me, a plastic poncho, and the rising water. Around us, the neighborhood was crumbling. Somewhere above, a kitten cried. This wasn't a simple rescue. It was survival, for all of us. The water had climbed to my knees by the time I lifted Sarraco from the jagged cluster of bamboo slats he had crawled onto. His ribs pushing out through drenched fur like skeletal fingers, his breath shallow and catching with each tremor of pain. His blood, dark and thin from the rain, had pooled around him in the shape of wilted petals, soaking into the wood as though the street itself mourned him. Every instinct told me I had to move fast, but there was something in the way he didn't struggle when I wrapped him in my jacket, like he'd already spent his last defiance on staying alive long enough to be found. I cradled him close, shielding him from the rain with my own body, and began to wade back toward the collapsed pharmacy where we had set up temporary shelter. The streets were a maze of floating debris and sagging electrical wires. Shattered glass drifted past me, and the skeletal remains of bicycles and stools twisted with each gust of wind. The sound of cats crying in the distance mixed with the screech of bending metal, the occasional thunderclap sending new waves of panic down my spine. I had always thought of cats as mysterious survivors, creatures born to slip through the cracks of human collapse. But this storm had taken even that from them. They were exposed here, fragile, cold, and scared. Somewhere behind me, I heard Jules shouting over the roar of the wind. He came splashing into view with a crate in his arms, the frantic squirming of a kitten visible through the slats. "I found her on the roof," he yelled, his voice cracking not just from the cold, but from the shock that comes from seeing something tiny and alive in a place so filled with death. I nodded and signaled for him to follow me. The clinic, if it could still be called that, was barely standing. The roof had caved in at one side, exposing the floor to rain, but we'd cleared a corner and layered it with dry towels and scraps of foam. Ulling Teresa was already there, sitting on a stool that rocked with every movement, her lap full of wet rags and trembling fur. She looked up, and her eyes locked onto Sirocco. Without a word, she reached for him, and I passed him over, knowing she had hands like old soil, capable of nurturing even things the world had given up on. The moment he was wrapped and placed near the others, the silence was almost reverent. Pippin mewed weakly, crawling toward Sirocco as if drawn by instinct. Datu, the battle-scarred Tom, sat rigid in the corner, watching everything with narrowed, unreadable eyes. The room was tense, held in the space between hope and futility. I knelt beside them, wiping my soaked hands on my shirt, and finally let myself breathe. But it was only the beginning. The cats weren't safe yet. Not from infection, not from hunger, not from the 100 other invisible things that would try to pull them under. And neither were we. By the time morning bruised the sky with its first gray streaks, the clinic smelled of iodine, wet fur, and old wood, a scent I would later come to associate with both sanctuary and sorrow. I'd barely slept. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw Sarraco's glazed expression staring up at me, his breath a soft stutter against the bundle of cloth he lay in. I checked on him constantly through the night, fingers pressed against his side to feel the faintest movement. He hadn't moved much, but he hadn't slipped away either. That was enough for now. Jules sat nearby, legs tucked under his chin, nodding off in intervals with Pippin curled beneath his shirt. The kitten had grown quieter, and although she had taken water from a dropper, her eyes were dull, her body limp with exhaustion. There was something terrifying about that kind of stillness in something so small. It felt like watching life retreat rather than rest. Dadu, ever the sentinel, had taken to prowling the perimeter of our space. His paw dragged slightly on the tiles, a soft, rhythmic scrape that somehow kept time with the dripping of rainwater from the ceiling. He wouldn't let anyone near him, not even Teresa, who had cared for dozens of strays before the storm swallowed everything familiar. The debate started quietly, in tired whispers that cracked around the edges. Teresa, ever pragmatic, believed the cats needed to be released once the roads cleared. "They have instincts," she said. "They'll find food. They'll survive better out there than locked in here with our dwindling rations." I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't shake the image of Sirocco lying alone in that street, bleeding and unmoving, with no one to even bury him had we come a few hours later. I looked at Jules, who'd been silent since the conversation began, and I could tell by the way he pulled Peepin closer that he wasn't ready to let go either. We scavenged what little we could from the surrounding ruins. A can of tuna from a toppled Sarraco store, a half bag of rice from a splintered porch, a few medical supplies that hadn't been soaked. It wasn't sustainable, and everyone knew it. Each time the wind howled, the walls of the clinic shuddered, and I imagined the ceiling giving way entirely, burying us all in a quiet, soaking tomb of wood and tile. But even then, I couldn't entertain the idea of setting the cats loose. Not yet. Not while they still looked at us with trust, or in Datu's case, with a wary sort of hopefulness, like he was waiting to be proven wrong. The tension simmered as each of us weighed the weight of choice against the urgency of survival. The cats weren't just animals anymore. They were passengers in the strange little ark we'd built in a drowned world. And whether we meant to or not, we'd become responsible for where they ended up when the water finally receded. It was just after midday, when the heat returned in cruel, stifling waves, that the first real crack in our fragile sanctuary revealed itself, not through collapsing walls or surging floodwater, but through Sarraco's sudden, uncontrollable tremors. He had been sleeping fitfully, his breath ragged but consistent, when his body began to seize, small at first, like a twitch in a dream, but then violent, spasmodic movements that sent the blood-soaked towel twisting beneath him. I shouted for Teresa, who rushed over without hesitation, the lines in her face deepening as she pressed both hands against his sides to keep him from hurting himself further. Jules froze, his eyes wide, shoulders rigid as if he too had absorbed the shock of it. There was nothing dramatic, no foaming mouth, no sudden collapse. But in the stillness that followed, Sarraco let out a sound so low and broken it felt more like a plea than a cry. Teresa looked at me, and her silence screamed louder than any storm. We didn't need words to understand what she saw. This wasn't just trauma from the storm. The wound on his side had begun to fester. The infection had spread, and without proper antibiotics, real ones, not just the last of our iodine and gauze, he would not last more than a day or two. I felt something inside me collapse, a quiet shattering that started in the chest and worked its way down. We'd fought so hard to keep them alive, to buy even one more day, and here the reality stood, undeniable and unflinching. We hadn't saved Sarraco. We had only delayed the inevitable. Teresa reached for a syringe from the med bag, one of the last we had, filled with a painkiller we'd been rationing. She didn't say what she meant to do, but I saw the question in her eyes, hovering just behind her calm. Do we keep him comfortable until the end, or do we let him go now, gently, before the pain takes him whole? I couldn't answer. My mouth opened, but no sound came. Jules spoke instead, not with words, but with motion. He stood and walked toward Sirocco, then sat down cross-legged and placed his small hand gently on the cat's trembling back. "He doesn't want to die," he whispered, eyes fixed on the bleeding fur, his voice breaking like a matchstick underfoot. "He looked at me last night. He doesn't want to die." Teresa lowered the syringe slowly, then set it aside. For a long moment, none of us moved. Outside, a bird cried, a sharp, ragged note from somewhere in the drowned trees. It sounded like a warning, or maybe a reminder. Not every fight ends with victory, but not every death is inevitable either. I turned toward the broken window and stared out across the flooded street, realizing that something had shifted, not just in Sarraco, but in all of us. We weren't just rescuing them anymore. We were beginning to fight with them. The clinic felt heavier after Sarraco's seizure, as if the very air had thickened with the weight of decisions no one wanted to name. No one said it aloud, but every movement, every silence was shaded by the question, how do we hold on to something that's slipping away? Teresa busied herself with the other cats, her hands moving in steady rhythms, cleaning wounds, changing bandages, sorting what little food remained, but her eyes would flicker back to Sirocco every few minutes. She had seen enough death to recognize its approach, but something in her posture told me she wasn't giving up. Not yet. Jules changed that night. The boy who had wept for Pippin now sat beside Sarraco with a focused, almost unshakable calm. He whispered to the cat softly, over and over, telling stories about the life they'd live once the sun came back. "You're gonna sit on my windowsill and sleep in the laundry basket," he murmured, tracing slow circles in the damp fur. "And you'll eat sardines every day, not just rainwater and scraps." It wasn't childish. It wasn't denial. It was belief, the kind that made you ache because you wanted to believe it too. I didn't stop him. There was something sacred about it. I kept moving between tasks, pretending that urgency was clarity, but the truth was, I didn't know what to do anymore. My training as a medic hadn't prepared me for this. No protocols for dying animals in a crumbling clinic surrounded by water. And it wasn't just Sarraco. Dadu had started limping worse than before, and Pippin's breathing had grown shallow, her small body barely reacting to touch. We were caught in the slow unraveling of hope, and each thread pulled looser the longer we stayed. It was around midnight when Teresa finally spoke. Her voice was low, almost lost beneath the steady tapping of rain against the window frame. "If we don't move soon, we'll lose them all. The road to the relief center, by the old church, it might have cleared." She didn't have to say what we all knew. The center had antibiotics, clean blankets, fresh food, but it also had rules. Pets weren't allowed, and we weren't registered evacuees. Jules turned sharply. "Then we sneak in," he said, his voice fierce and small at the same time. "We carry them in our coats, in boxes. I don't care. We'll hide them if we have to." I didn't respond right away. I just stared at Sarraco, still curled in the towel, his chest lifting in tiny, steady movements. There was no guarantee he'd survive the trip, but there was no future here either. The storm hadn't broken us in a single wave. It had worn us down by degrees, softening every certainty until all that was left were fragments of belief, stitched together by the hands of people too stubborn to stop trying. And now we stood at another edge, with choices that could save them, or end everything. We left just before sunrise, wrapped in layered shirts and soaked in tensions. The water had finally receded enough to make the road walkable, though it still sucked at our boots like it wanted to pull us back. Jules carried Pippin zipped inside his jacket, her tiny head barely visible through the folds. I took Sirocco in a repurposed basket lined with whatever cloth we had left dry, and Teresa, stoic as always, managed Datu, who hissed low and constant, but did not claw. Even he seemed to understand what was at stake. The road toward the old church wasn't just broken, it was unrecognizable. Trees lay tangled with power lines, houses split in half like fruit peeled wrong, and every few steps, we passed remnants of other lives scattered across the mud. A slipper, a soaked wedding photo, a child's toy with one eye. The silence was different out here, less of an absence, more of a hum, as if the earth hadn't quite stopped screaming. Teresa walked ahead with purpose, navigating through it like someone who had walked this kind of grief before. When we reached the clearing near the chapel, it was Jules who spotted them first. Two men in gray vests standing by the relief trucks. At first glance, they looked like salvation. Clean clothes, radios, the glint of bottled water stacked in crates. But as we stepped closer, we saw the caution in their posture, the way their eyes narrowed when they spotted the animals. One of them raised a hand. "No pets," he said flatly, before we even spoke. "No exceptions. They bring disease. They slow down evacuation. You'll have to leave them." I felt my grip tighten around the basket as Sarraco stirred beneath the blanket, letting out a faint groan like he was protesting the order himself. Jules stepped forward, shaking, angry, defiant. "He's not a disease," he said, chin raised, voice thin but sharp. "He's bleeding. He needs help. They all do." The man didn't flinch. "We're not set up for animals," he replied, not cruelly, just with that mechanical, unbending tone of someone who has been told no so many times they've stopped hearing why. Teresa put a hand on my arm. "We go around," she whispered. "Through the side alley. There's an old classroom in back. They're storing supplies there. If we're quiet, no one will notice." Her voice wasn't panicked. It was resolved. She had already decided. So we backed away slowly, pretending to leave, then cut left through the brush behind the chapel. The mud swallowed our shoes, branches scratched our skin, and somewhere nearby, a generator hummed like a warning. Every step was a risk. If they caught us, we could be turned away for good. But we didn't speak. We just moved. Not as rescuers now, but as fugitives, carrying bundles of fur and fever like they were treasure. The line between defiance and care had blurred completely, and still, none of us would let go. The classroom was dim, lit only by a cracked pane of glass that filtered pale morning light across the dust-coated desks and tarpaulin stacks. It smelled like chalk and diesel, like memories and urgency colliding in one forgotten corner of the world. We had made it. No one had stopped us. Teresa slid the bolt quietly behind us, her breathing shallow but calm. Jules dropped to his knees, unzipped his jacket, and let peeping out onto a folded blanket we'd salvaged from a rusted locker. The kitten moved her head just barely, enough to show she was still with us, still trying. I placed Sirocco gently on a flattened sack of rice, checking the gauze. The wound on his side had opened again, seeping dark red into the cloth. It was a slow leak, but insistent, just like the fear now crawling under my skin. We'd gotten this far, risked everything to smuggle them into shelter. But now what? We had no vet, no guarantee the meds we found would even work, and time was thinning like the breath in Sarraco's lungs. For a moment, I looked away. I couldn't bear to see him fight so hard for life while I stood there unsure whether I was saving him or prolonging his pain. That's when Teresa spoke. Not unkindly, but with the quiet weight of someone who has carried too much and still does. "You have to be sure," she said, looking at me, not accusing but asking. "Because if he dies here, it won't be nature. It'll be choice, yours." The words struck something deep in me. I had seen men die in floods, in rubble, on stretchers where my hands pressed against wounds too wide to close. I'd learned how to keep breathing when the crying wouldn't stop, how to keep my voice steady when telling someone their brother wouldn't be coming home. But this bleeding cat with haunted eyes, he was breaking me. Not with noise or drama, but with his silence, with the trust he gave me freely, even as his body failed. Jules overheard her and turned quickly, defensive and bright-eyed. "It's not his choice alone," he said, sharp. "We're all here. We all matter. He matters too." His words didn't land hard, they landed right. Not just because he was right, but because I needed to hear it. I looked down at Sarraco again and saw something in him that I hadn't fully noticed before. Even in that battered body, he had never stopped watching us, tracking movement, blinking when we spoke, flinching when Pippin cried. There was life there, fragile, yes, dying, maybe, but not gone. I turned back to Teresa. "We fight for him," I said quietly. "As long as he's still trying, we do too." She nodded once, and that was that. In a room made for order and rules, we chose defiance again. Not loud, not reckless, but deliberate. We were no longer waiting for rescue. We had become the rescue. The silence in the classroom didn't last. By mid-afternoon, the hum of the generator cut out without warning, plunging the back end of the church compound into a quiet so stark it made my skin prickle. It wasn't just silence, it was absence. No hum meant no fans, no refrigeration, no charging radios. The supplies we had borrowed, stolen was probably more accurate, were now melting in plastic tubs. Whatever antibiotics we had managed to find, hastily scavenged from cracked crates and mislabeled bottles, had to be used now or not at all. Teresa wasted no time. She boiled the last of the clean water on a camp stove and prepared the injection while I held Sirocco still, murmuring softly to keep him calm. The needle slid in beneath his skin, and for a second he jerked, a reflex, but then settled again, his breathing uneven but still steady. We had no way of knowing if it was the right dosage, or even if the drug was meant for cats. It was meant for survival, and that had become the only qualification we cared about. Then Datu disappeared. It happened in the quiet minutes between doses and rest. One moment he was lying curled beneath a desk, his eyes half closed but alert. The next, the space was empty. Jules called his name slowly at first, then louder, his voice cracking in the echoing silence. We all searched, the closets, the supply corners, the warped hallway outside. Nothing. It didn't seem possible. Datu was wounded, he couldn't have gone far. But wounded or not, he had left, and none of us could figure out why. Teresa was the first to say it out loud. Maybe he knew, she muttered, not to be cruel, but because she'd seen animals do things people couldn't explain. Some cats go away to die. I wanted to argue, to push back, but I couldn't. Part of me knew it was true, and yet another part, stubborn, desperate, held on to the idea that maybe Datu hadn't left to give up. Maybe he'd left because he didn't want to die surrounded by fear and rot. Maybe he was still looking for something better. That night, a different noise broke the stillness. Shouting, far off but closing in. The relief workers. They were sweeping the perimeter, checking for looters. We ducked low, turned off every light, held our breath in a room filled with shadows and tension. Through a gap in the boarded window, I saw the flicker of flashlight beams, heard voices calling out codes and radio clicks. One wrong move, one small noise from Pepin or Sirocco, and we'd be discovered. There would be no explaining why we were here, no defending why we'd chosen a cat's life over protocol. As they passed, the air hung heavy with unspoken thoughts. We'd come so far, and yet the line between saviors and criminals was now as thin as the crack in the glass. Jules clutched Pepin tighter. Teresa held her breath. I closed my eyes and prayed Datu wasn't dying alone somewhere we couldn't reach. We never found Datu. Not that night, not the next morning, not even when Jules returned to the alleyways behind the chapel, calling softly into the piles of debris with food in his hand and hope in his voice. There was no blood, no trail, no obvious sign of struggle, just absence. A kind of quiet disappearance that settled into us like a shadow we couldn't shake. I didn't say it aloud, but I saw it in Jules's face. He hadn't given up. He'd started setting out scraps of rice and fish in the windowsill each night, like breadcrumbs for a ghost he still believed might come back. Back in the classroom, Sarraco had grown quieter, but no longer trembled with fever. His breathing was shallow, but steadier now, the wound less angry thanks to Teresa's mix of antibiotics and boiled herbs. The bandages had to be changed twice a day, and each time we peeled them back, it was like turning a page in a slow, uncertain novel. We couldn't tell what the ending would be, but the story still moved forward. That was enough for us to keep reading. Pepin, surprisingly, had started to play again. Small things at first, batting at threads on the edge of Jules's jacket or chasing a dried leaf that had blown in through the door crack. It was the kind of thing that might have gone unnoticed in a house full of noise, but here, in this fragile silence we shared, it was thunderous. Teresa watched her with a stillness that bordered on reverence, her mouth pressing into the faintest of smiles. "She's too young to know she shouldn't be happy," she whispered, almost to herself. "Maybe that's what will save her." I began noticing it more and more, these quiet acts of connection that stitched us together, not just to each other but to the animals we'd thrown ourselves into saving. Teresa, once strict and clinical, had begun humming lullabies while tending to Sirocco, her voice soft and cracked like old vinyl. Jules made up stories about Pepin's adventures, how she would someday become the queen of the rooftops, how Datu had left to build her a palace in the sky. And I had stopped thinking of Sirocco as the cat. He was someone now. Someone I listened to when his breathing changed, someone I reassured when his muscles tensed at unfamiliar sounds, someone who had trusted me with his pain, his silence, and whatever life he had left to give. None of us said what we were thinking, that we'd gone beyond rescue now. This wasn't just triage. This was care. This was family, twisted together in the aftermath of a storm, held by the fragile threads of shared survival. And yet, even as we nurtured what we had, a tension still lived in the edges of our peace. The relief center was becoming more heavily patrolled. Supplies were dwindling. Rumors swirled of relocation orders, new shelters being opened in the highlands, where animals definitely wouldn't be allowed. The world beyond the classroom was pressing closer, reminding us with each passing hour that nothing we built here was permanent. But that didn't stop us from building. Not now. Not while there was still breath and bond and one unopened can of sardines left on the shelf. The rain returned with no warning, sweeping over the compound in sheets so thick the chapel bell disappeared in mist. It wasn't the violent, wind-driven chaos from the early days of the typhoon, but it carried something heavier, more final. A slow, relentless downpour that reminded us we were still beneath a sky that could turn cruel in a heartbeat. The puddles rose again outside the classroom, creeping toward the door like the storm was retracing its steps, determined to erase what we had dared to preserve. Inside, the atmosphere had changed. The tension wasn't loud, but it lingered in every glance. Every breath held a moment too long. We were running out of time. The food would last another day, maybe two. The antibiotics were nearly gone. The generator had sputtered back to life, but its fuel was nearly depleted, and no one knew when the relief trucks would restock the supplies. Worse, there were whispers. Official notices pinned to the chapel doors. Mandatory relocation within 48 hours. Evacuees were to be bussed inland. No animals allowed. No negotiations. We sat in the half-light, the three of us and the two cats, as the air thickened with unsaid thoughts. Teresa was the first to break the silence. "We have to think about what happens next," she said, her tone gentle but edged with realism. "If we go to the new camp, we can't take them. If we stay, we lose food, medical help, power. Either way." Her voice trailed off, unfinished, because the ending didn't need to be spoken. It was already curling at the edges of every thought we had. Jules didn't speak. He just kept petting Puppin, whose small belly now rose and fell with ease. She had started purring again, faint, barely audible, but there. I watched him as he held her closer, his shoulders drawn tight, as if trying to shelter her from the future with just his body. I wanted to protect him from this choice as much as I wanted to protect the cats. But none of us were shielded anymore. "I'm not leaving Sirocco," I said, and the words came out low, fierce, not because I was sure of anything, but because I needed something solid to hold on to. If they want to move us, they'll have to take us both. It wasn't bravery. It was desperation dressed as defiance. Teresa exhaled slowly, her expression unreadable. "Then we make a plan," she said simply. "But you need to be ready for what that means." She was right. We all knew what it meant. Staying meant risking starvation. Leaving meant abandoning the animals we had bled, wept, and healed for. There was no middle ground. Outside, the water crept higher. Inside, the warmth of two living bodies pressed against ours reminded us why we'd held on this long. Still, the hourglass was emptying. The moment of decision had arrived, not with drama, but with quiet inevitability. We had to choose, our place in safety or theirs. The rain didn't let up. It hung in the air like breath held too long, seeping into the bones of the building and the backs of our minds. Every corner of the classroom now held some trace of our presence. Blankets folded in crates, a patch of sunlight claimed by Pippin each morning, the faint marks of Sarraco's slow steps when he gathered enough strength to rise and stretch. And yet none of it felt permanent. Not anymore. The following morning, we received confirmation. The trucks would arrive by nightfall. Mandatory relocation, 5-minute boarding intervals, no exceptions. We were to pack only what we could carry on our backs. Teresa read the notice aloud with a stillness that unnerved me, then folded the paper and tucked it into her coat without another word. We didn't speak for a long time. There was no more space for arguments. The conflict had drained into a quiet pool of choices none of us wanted to touch. Eventually, she spoke, not as a rescuer or a realist, but as someone who had lost too many times before. "We can't save everyone," she whispered, kneeling beside Sirocco with a hand so gentle it seemed to ask for forgiveness. "But we can choose who we stand beside when the time comes." Jules stood slowly, Pippin tucked into the sling he had fashioned from an old shirt. "Then I'm staying," he said, voice small but unshaking. "You said we all matter, right? Well, she matters too. I'm not leaving her for a bus seat." My heart cracked quietly in my chest. I wanted to wrap him in 1,000 reassurances, tell him that we'd find a way, that maybe someone would listen, would understand. But no one had listened before. No one had come looking for these animals. That job had always been ours alone. Teresa looked at me then, really looked. "If we stay, we do it knowing no one's coming for us. No backup, no rescue." Her eyes softened. "And they'll mark us as non-compliant. We may not get another chance." I met her gaze and felt something inside settle, not out of clarity, but because I finally stopped trying to find an option that didn't exist. "Then we stay," I said, and the words felt like stepping into a storm barefoot. "Even if it's just us." She nodded slowly, and that was it. No great speeches, no dramatic gestures, just a quiet decision made in the stillness of a crumbling room, the same way we'd made every other choice. surrounded by fur, rain, and a love so fierce it had long since ceased to be reasonable. We spent the next hours preparing, not for departure but for permanence. Rationing what food we had, reinforcing the window seams, hiding the generator deeper into the building's rear. We didn't know how long we could hold out. We didn't know what would come next. But we knew we wouldn't be boarding the truck, and neither would they. The trucks came at dusk, just as the horizon bled orange into ash, their diesel engines humming low like an approaching storm of a different kind. We heard them before we saw them, 3, maybe 4, rumbling over cracked pavement like beasts of burden summoned to cleanse what remained. They pulled into the courtyard behind the chapel with mechanical precision, their doors swinging open, footsteps marching with purpose. Voices barked names, whistled instructions, shouted about order and time. It felt like a countdown. We stayed hidden in the classroom, lights off, breath held, hearts thudding in rhythms we could no longer ignore. The cats knew. They didn't run, didn't panic, but their eyes followed us as we moved, their bodies tense and alert. Pipin pressed herself deeper into Jules's arms, her tiny claws gripping his sleeve as if she understood that something important, something final, was about to happen. Sirocco lay curled in his blanket, gaze steady, chest rising like the tide, slow, deliberate, defiant. Teresa crouched by the window, watching the buses fill with evacuees. One woman argued loudly at the front gate, her voice shrill with fear. "I have a dog. He's all I have left," she cried, but the reply was immediate and merciless. "No animals. Either you get on now, or you stay behind." That sentence struck through us like a blade. It wasn't just policy, it was reality being written in the present tense, and it made everything we decided feel heavier, more dangerous. I caught a glimpse of the field marshal through the crack in the boards. He moved efficiently, a clipboard in one hand, radio in the other. No softness, no negotiation. The kind of man who wouldn't hesitate to clear out non-compliant civilians if he found them. Jules looked at me, and for the first time since we'd met, I saw the tremble in him, not fear exactly, but the pressure of being young and brave at the same time. "What if they come in here?" he asked, voice barely a whisper. "If they come," I said quietly, "we tell them the truth, that we stayed behind for lives that couldn't speak for themselves." Teresa turned from the window, her face pale in the growing shadows. "Truth doesn't always protect you." "I know," I replied, "but it's still the right thing." Minutes passed like hours. The last call rang out across the courtyard. Engines revved. The sound of feet against pavement faded into the distance as the final group boarded. And then, silence. Not peace, just the hush of being left behind. We didn't speak. We just stood there in the quiet, surrounded by half-packed crates, scattered blankets, the low hum of a dying generator. The trucks were gone, the gates were closed. The rain began again, light this time, like the sky was exhaling. We weren't safe. We weren't secure. But we were together, 3 humans, 2 fragile lives, and an absence named Datu. And now that the world had made its choice, we were finally free to make ours, without apology, without permission. That night we didn't sleep. The kind of silence that settled wasn't restful. It was too full of weight, too thick with the aftermath of choosing to be left behind. Outside, the wind returned in whispers, brushing the edges of the broken glass and hollow frames like fingers tapping to see if anything still lived inside. Inside, the air was dense with stillness, as if the room itself was bracing for what came next. Sarraco stirred just after midnight. I had been sitting beside him, not out of vigilance, but because I couldn't bear to move. His breathing had become slower, but no longer labored. His body, frail and battered, no longer twitched from pain. He turned his head slightly and looked up at me, not with desperation, not even with fatigue, but with a quiet, steady calm. There was nothing left in that gaze but presence and trust. Teresa woke without a word. She came over and knelt beside us, gently feeling the cat's side. Her touch was practiced, respectful. She looked at me afterward, her eyes soft. "He's not dying," she whispered, more to herself than to me. "He's choosing to stay." And in that moment, everything changed. We had framed the entire rescue as a race against death, against infection, bureaucracy, time. But what we hadn't understood was that Sirocco had never given up. He'd held on with every fragment of strength, not because we had carried him, but because he had wanted to reach this moment, this room, these people. Not to escape death, but to live, even if for just a little while, among others who didn't let go. I bent down and whispered to him, voice shaking, "We'll stay with you, as long as it takes, however long you want." It wasn't a vow of rescue anymore. It was a vow of presence, of being. No more conditions, no more timelines. Across the room, Jules wrapped Pepin in his arms and began to cry. Not the frantic sobs of fear, but quiet, aching tears of release. He had carried more than any child should, had risked more than anyone ever expected of him, and now, at last, he let it go. Pepin nuzzled into his chest, purring softly, and for once, that was enough. Teresa sat with her back to the door, staring out into the darkness beyond the boarded windows. "We stay," she said, "as long as we can, then longer if we have to." It wasn't an announcement. It was a decision already settled into her bones. And so we did. In a half-flooded classroom no longer marked on any official map, 3 humans and 2 animals continued their quiet rebellion. We shared food. We watched the days come and go. We waited, not for rescue, but for healing, in all its slow, uncertain forms. We didn't know how long we had, but we had each other. And in that battered, bleeding world, that was everything. It's been weeks now since the last relief truck left the chapel. No one's come looking, and in a way, I've stopped expecting them to. We don't count the days anymore, not because we've given up, but because we've settled into a rhythm not dictated by schedules or instructions, but by breath, by appetite, by moments of quiet triumph and unspoken grace. Sirocco is still with us. The infection didn't win. It didn't vanish either, but it shifted, became something manageable, something that didn't define him. His wound has scarred over, and though he walks with a limp, it's a deliberate stride, slow but certain. He doesn't hide anymore. He rests in the center of the room now, claiming space the way only the truly resilient can, without apology, without fear. I sometimes catch him staring out through the gaps in the boards as if watching for something, or maybe remembering the world before it broke. I wonder if he knows how many of us survived because he did. Pipin has grown louder. Jules says she's earned it. She plays now, constantly, chasing bottle caps, unraveling strings, climbing over everything she can reach. Her body is still thin, still fragile, but her joy is large. She lives without hesitation. Jules has changed too. The quiet, trembling boy I met beneath storm-gray skies now speaks with conviction, not because he's trying to be brave, but because he is. He doesn't ask anymore if we made the right choice. He knows we did. And Teresa, she's softer around the edges, but stronger in the center. There's a steadiness in her now that wasn't there before, a kind of peace that comes only after making the impossible choice and standing firm in its aftermath. She hums more often now. I don't know the tune, but I know it means we're okay. We still don't have electricity most nights. We ration food, we hide when patrols come too close. But in the shadows of abandonment, we've carved out something real. Not perfect, not safe, but true. And maybe that's more than most get. There are days I still wonder about Dado. Whether he found shelter, whether he laid down somewhere dry, somewhere familiar, whether he watches the moon like we do, from a safe distance, carrying the same stubborn heartbeat that brought him through the storm. I like to think he does. This wasn't the ending I imagined, but maybe it was never supposed to be an ending at all. Because rescue, I've learned, isn't always loud or immediate or heroic. Sometimes it's quiet and difficult. Sometimes it's just staying when others walk away. Sometimes it's choosing to love something fragile, over and over again, even when the world tells you not to. And maybe, just maybe, this story isn't finished. Maybe it's the first of many. If this story moved you, if you've ever felt the quiet weight of choosing love over convenience, or stood beside something small when it would have been easier to walk away, then you're part of this journey now too. Sarraco's fight to live wasn't just his. It became ours. And maybe it reminded you that life is built in those moments where we stay, when everything says we should leave. So if this story made you feel something, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel to follow the rest of this journey, because there are more voices to be heard, more lives to be saved, and more stories waiting in the quiet corners of the world. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder. Not all rescues look heroic. Some are quiet, some are impossible. But they all matter. And if you've ever chosen to stay, thank you. You already understand.